Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to go over my round 8 game from the Charlotte Summer GM-IM Invitational. Now if you followed the round 7 video, I actually got my first win, and it came totally by surprise. It was a complete gift, actually. I was completely losing, and all of a sudden, in the span of a few moves, I managed to turn things around with help from my opponent, of course. And it was a huge swing because it essentially took me from potentially being -3, which would have happened if I had lost my third game, to all of a sudden winning it and being on -1. So going into this game, I was only one game away from being on 50%, and that was a huge difference just rating-wise and confidence-wise. So I was still relatively optimistic going into the last 2 rounds. Now, my opponent in this one was a strong Grandmaster by the name of Grigoryan, and he's actually fairly young. He's, I believe, 24 years old, from Armenia, and at his peak was actually 2,600 FIDE. So very, very tough opponent. At the time of this game, he was around 2,550, but, you know, again, very, very strong player, so I was not taking him lightly at all. And really, this was just an opportunity for me to kind of build on any of the momentum I had had from round 7. So I tried to, come in with a positive attitude and the white pieces and see what happens. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm with d4. Karen went knight f6. I wasn't really sure what he was going to play, whether it was going to be a King's Indian or a Perk or a Grunfeld. I mean, he seemed to be a very dynamic player, so it was tough to really predict. But I really was going to try and nullify the dynamism by playing bishop f4. And yes, so we have another London system. And the London system has actually been, a personal favorite of mine, for quite some time. If you've followed the channel, I've had some pretty nice wins with it. And essentially, the idea with the system is just to develop, get more of a controlled game as opposed to having like a very frenetic, kind of wild game. I want to just develop my pieces, establish some control, and then grind. And this suits my style pretty well, so that's why I keep going back to it when I don't really have, lines that I want to challenge in the King's Indian or the Grunfeld. In any case, after bishop f4, d6 was played, and I went e3, and then g6, and c3. This is a little bit of an unusual move order, actually, but I basically just want to establish this chain of pawns. Typically, I might throw a knight f3 before even moving the c pawn, but I decided to play this way in this game. Bishop g7 was played, and now I went bishop e2. Part of the reason I went bishop e2 here is because it dawned on me that I hadn't played h3 yet. So I thought that if I actually go knight f3, let me back up. If I go knight f3 here, I thought it was maybe possible for my bishop to get chased around the horn. And note that at bishop g3 could just get the bishop pair. So I thought, you know what, maybe I should go bishop e2 first just to stop knight h5. But now he castled, and I kind of took a little bit of a step in the wrong direction because now I went knight f3. And this move is not necessarily bad, but it does kind of invite knight h5, whereas if I throw in h3, knight h5 isn't a possibility. So knight f3 was a kind of a move order mistake on my part because I do invite knight h5 and giving him the bishop pair. And I could challenge him, like if knight h5, I could go bishop g5 and after h6, bishop h4, and at least force his pawn to g5. But even so, it's clear that I'm going to lose my bishop on h4, and that's not totally what I wanted to happen. So yeah, maybe I should have thrown in h3, but he didn't go for it and instead went b6, and this was actually kind of a nice reprieve for me because now I actually played h3 very, very quickly and was like, whew, dodge that bullet. And now after bishop b7, knight bd2, and knight bd7, we're back in kind of the traditional London territory that I've actually played several times now this year where essentially I castle now, and after castles I have the nice pawn chain, my knight's on d2 and f3, my bishop on f4, it can drop back to h2 if needed because of the h3 move, and kind of the nice development that I'm looking for. Black now went rook e8, and this is a little bit unusual. Typically, c5 is the try that black players go for instead of e5, but rook e8 does invite e5, and e5 is playable. It's just typically black players don't want to play e5 because after the bishop drops back, there's counter chances on this diagonal, on the h2 b8 diagonal. So in many lines, the pawn on e7 stays there to just support the pawn on d6 and block off the line for the f4 bishop. In many instances, in the King's in the London system against the King's Indian, you have this battle of the pawn chains that are both restricting the opponent's dark squared bishops. So the question is like, who's going to kind of budge first or blink first and open up the scope of the dark squared bishop for their opponent? And because typically neither side really wants to do that. So anyways, after rook e8, you can see that e5 is a threat, or at least an idea. And there's always a question of whether you want to allow e5 with tempo or not. So if I didn't want to allow e5 with tempo, I could drop the bishop back to g3 or h2 as a form of prophylaxis, just kind of preparing against the eventual e5 break. I decided that it wasn't mission critical for me to stop to deal with the e5 break prophylactically, so instead I decided to go a4. And this is the classic London system flank move, where you try to go a5 and get a little bit of a rub on the queen side with this pawn tension with a5 and b6. And actually, I had a very, very similar game and structure early on in this tournament against Christopher Wu. So, not Christopher Wu, Christopher Yu. Yeah, I mean, it's just it's a certain way to play, just to play a4 and a5. And the question is always, how is black going to respond? Is black going to allow a5? Are they going to stop it by playing a5 themselves? Or are they going to stop it by playing a6? A6 is traditionally the sort of theory-approved move, if you will. The point is that after you play a6, a5 for white isn't desirable anymore because black can go b5 and shut down that pawn tension. And now this pawn on a5 is a potential weakness in the long term. And c5, the c5 break could come in and just hassle my queen side even further. So typically a5 is not played after a6, and that's why a6 is typically the move. Now, the one thing that is kind of a flaw with a6, and I have mentioned this before, is that it does become a target for the bishop on e2. So there could be a position down the road, much, much further down the road, where this a6 pawn might be a tiny, tiny liability, but normally it doesn't wind up being the case. The other way you can deal with it is you could play a5. And a5 is actually the move that Christopher Yu played against me earlier in the tournament, and I found that to be a very, very strange move because you weaken a lot of light squares in the camp once the pawn's on a5, and so I wasn't a huge fan of it, although it's totally playable. Karen actually went for e5 and kind of ignored the a5 move altogether, at least for now, because he's punching first in the center. And whenever e5 is played, you kind of want to decide whether to take on e5 and open up the d file potentially, or to drop the bishop back and keep the tension. Both are playable. If you play d takes e5, d takes e5, bishop g3 is totally fine, and this knight might come to c4 at some point to challenge the e5 pawn, but maybe not right away, because if you move the knight to c4 very quickly, black has knight e4 challenging the bishop on g3. So I might start with moves like queen c2, rook f d1, and so on. Also a5 is an option, and yeah, I mean, white has a very playable position, but so does black. Black has good control of the center with this e5 pawn move. Typically, though, it's sometimes it is a little bit difficult to play with this e5 pawn because you don't really want to push it, because you block out the scope of the bishop on b7, and you open up the scope of the bishop on this diagonal. And this is the point, is that if this bishop on g3 gets this open diagonal, typically it can wreak some havoc. So, but instead of going for this, I decided to play bishop h2 and keep the tension. This is one of the devices in the system that I think is quite annoying for black to deal with, because now the knight on d7 is frozen. It can't move to f8 or anywhere else until it resolves the tension in the center, because I have 3 attackers on that pawn on e5. And if black plays e4, all of a sudden my bishop on h2 has that scope again that I really was kind of looking for. So yeah, this is just another way to play the position and keep the tension. It's quite nice. And again, white is not better, but it's just an interesting way to play. Black actually now went a6, dealing with this this a5 move prophylactically. And yeah, it's a reasonable move. So he basically just played e5 and then decided to play a6 next. So fair enough. And I went queen b3. Typical move in this structure. The point is that the queen eyes the f7 pawn. Sometimes there's knight g5 as an idea. Sometimes bishop c4. And yeah, very interesting position. Maybe I should have started with d takes e5 first, because now after like d takes e5, maybe now some queen b3 or bishop c4 has a little bit more venom. For instance, if I go bishop c4 here, now knight g5 might actually be a threat getting on the f7 pawn. So maybe that would have been slightly better way to do it, because after I played queen b3, black very quickly went knight e4. And this was kind of, I don't know, it wasn't the end of the world, but it was a little bit of an annoying device, that trading device that would not have been possible, I don't think, if I played bishop c4. For instance, if d takes, bishop c4, knight e4, knight takes, bishop takes, now I actually have the very nice looking knight g5. And the point is I'm hitting f7 twice, and if you play queen takes g5, oh my gosh, actually this doesn't work. I was going to say this worked because queen takes d7 and queen f7, but actually queen g2 mate comes first, so maybe knight g5 is not an option. But something just tells me keeping this bishop on this diagonal right away would make this knight e4 operation not as attractive. Maybe one way I could have done it a little bit better is I actually start with a move like queen b3, for instance. And now if queen e7, I have bishop f7, queen f7, queen takes, king takes, and knight g5 check. And again, you can kind of see where there are some tactics on the f7 pawn, and this bishop on e4 is just a little bit loose. And so that's why I do believe that I maybe should have taken on e5 first before, starting my, before putting my queen or my bishop on the a2, g8 diagonal. Instead, after queen b3, knight e4, takes, I now don't have knight g5 because the queen is holding that square. And so I went knight d2. And yeah, it's just not the same effect here. I'm not getting the same type of play on the f7 pawn that I would like. And as a result, black kind of gets off scot-free. Another point here is that whenever this bishop's on e4, sometimes it is a little bit misplaced because it's, caught out in the open. So maybe it would have been better to not challenge that bishop and let it, waste tempo and actually go to safety. And so another way I could have played the position is just to play rook fd1. And the point is that I just keep the tension in the position, and maybe d takes e5 is actually a threat at some point, eyeing the queen on d8 with my rook on d1. And there's some play in this type of position where, my rooks are already connected, whites aren't. And yeah, I mean, there might be a potential target on f7. There's still positive pawn tension on e5. I think white's a tiny bit better. At least it's easier to play white. I'll put it that way. So, yeah, another opportunity I could have gone for. But instead, I went knight d2. And after knight d2, bishop b7. And then I went for this maneuver that you should be somewhat familiar with if you've seen some London games on this channel before. And it's the move bishop f3. And the idea is that you try to get rid of these light squared bishops and then take advantage of some of the light squares on the queen side that might be a little bit sensitive in the absence of that bishop on b7. So that was pretty much the idea there. Also, you kind of nullify the pressure on the g2 pawn that was, possible with queen g5. So very, very multi-purpose. Anyways, after bishop f3, e4 was played, and e4 is actually a move I kind of underestimated because I was talking ad nauseum about the bishop being on h2 being kind of left to its own devices on this diagonal. That's a good thing for white. But it actually turns out here that, you know, the space advantage actually matters more. And the real issue is that after I go bishop e2 back and black went d5, it dawned on me that my knight on d2 is very, very misplaced and doesn't really have a great future. If you look at the bishop on h2, this is perfectly placed, and the bishop on e2 is also pretty okay. But this knight on d2 really struggles to get any type of square in the middle. Ideally, this knight would love to be on, like, I don't know, b4 or f4 or something like that. But you note that both those squares are 2 diagonals away, so it's not really going to happen. And the real issue is that I thought, you know, if black tries to take the center like this, I can very easily undermine it by playing the move c4. But when I got to this position, I realized that c4 would be a massive, massive mistake because it actually weakens the d4 pawn. And as a result, if I play c4, black can actually strike with c5 and take over the initiative because the d4 pawn is just as sensitive as the d5 pawn, and my knight on d2 is not actually ready for the d file to be open yet because it's sensitive. So once I saw this line with c4 and c5, I realized that I could not play c4 and that my knight was just super passive and that this was going to be a problem. So instead, what I decided to do here is I decided to turtle and kind of, you know, almost play it like a queen's gambit declined, where, you know, black is going to have the space with probably playing c5, but I can try to turtle on the last three ranks and kind of see if black overextends. Now you might say, well, what do you mean queen's gambit decline? There's this line in the bishop f4 queen's gambit declined. I think it's called the Harwitz variation, in which this type of triangle pawn structure happens and black takes a lot of space in the center. Or sorry, normally it's white that's the white side is playing the queen's gambit decline and takes a lot of space in the center. And black is able to kind of hold the fort down by trading pieces on the A and B files and undermine the center with b3 at some point when a black pawn gets to c4. And that was kind of what I was angling for here, because I realized I don't have good counterplay if I play c4. It's just bad. So I started that operation with rook fc1. And rook fc1 is a very, very, difficult move to make. I mean, it's not an active move. It's not even preparing c4. But it was just kind of acknowledgement that I have to turtle. And the idea here was that I was going to bring my queen back to d1, but I wanted my rooks to be connected first. So that's why I played rook fc1. c5 was played. I expected that. And now I went queen d1. And my idea now is that the rooks are connected. I'm eyeing this b5 break. So if he takes all the space, I might be able to undermine. And then maybe there's some reality where I have knight b3 and maybe even knight a5 challenging this bishop on b7 in a dream scenario. Like if black gets super lazy, let's say h6, knight b3, h5, I'm just making examples, d takes e5, if b takes e5, knight a5, this would be like a dream scenario where all of a sudden I managed to get the two bishops and play against black center. Note that the rook can't come to b8 in many of these lines because the bishop is on h2. So, yeah, of course that did not happen. After queen d1, I thought black should just hold the position by playing queen e7 and just slowly improve. You could play queen e7, rook a c8, play down the c file, play h5, h4, take space on the king side, and just slow play it, but keep this pawn tension because this is negative pawn tension for me. Note, I don't want to play d takes c5 because then black has two attractive options. They can play b takes c5 or knight takes c5. And, black has a positive pawn tension because he pretty much can take or push whenever he wants. But for some reason, I think Karen was playing a little bit too quickly and decided to break the tension right away with not with queen e7, with c4. And c4 is actually a serious, serious mistake in my opinion because, You're basically releasing the tension when you didn't need to do that, and you give me the opportunity to undermine the center right away. And yeah, I thought all of a sudden I wasn't even worse because I can just undermine the chain so quickly, and my bishop on h2 is actually really well placed, much better than black's dark squared bishop at the moment. So I thought I'm going to get counterplay very quickly on the queen side. And so after c4, I rushed to play b3 and undermine this chain. And note that now white is actually kind of, playing again because you pretty much have to reinforce the center. If you play c takes b3, I go queen takes b3, and then I break with c4, and it's white that has the better pawn structure and again has the play along the a2, f7 diagonal. So instead, after b3, black played b5, and then I took on b5, a takes b5, and then took on a8, bishop takes a8, and then rook a1. And I thought, okay, black has a little bit more space on the queen side, but I control the one open file with my rook, and my bishop on h2 controls the entry square for the black rook on the b file. So I thought white was kind of doing decently here. Black now went queen b6, and this is actually a serious mistake, but it's not so easy to sort of see why from this particular moment. Instead, the computer wants to go knight f8 and reroute this knight to a more meaningful square. I think in some lines the knight can go to e6, or maybe it's just protecting the back rank in some weird way. Maybe there's some h5, knight h7 ideas. I'm not so sure. The computer was suggesting knight f8, but queen b6 is actually a serious mistake. And part of the reason for this is that the queen tactically is a little bit vulnerable on b6. Now, it did make some sense to try and reinforce the b5 pawn on the b file, and also to maybe try to activate the rook on c8. But again, this queen will be a little bit tactically vulnerable, and we'll see why in a moment. I took on c4, and now d takes c4 was played, and d takes c4 is another mistake. I think his idea was to try and utilize the d5 square for his knight, and then, really make hay against the c3 pawn. But the issue is that he's really weakening his pawn structure by doing this, and all of a sudden, my pawn structure is better because I have one nice pawn island. And so right now, it pretty much looks like black has three islands because you have these two, this one, and then the one on e4 is, it can potentially be connected with f5, but probably won't be because that will just weaken this diagonal too much. And so it's just a little bit too weakening, and just in this moment, I'm able to take advantage of that. Instead, b takes c4 would have been better, and although the computer was still giving this as an equal position, I actually tend to favor white's chances here just because I have the move rook a2, and I can actually play queen a1 and rook b2 and control the a and the b files as needed. And the only piece that's a problem in my position is the knight on d2. The knight on d2 is still a problem piece, but there are actually some lines where I might consider sacking on c4. For instance, if bishop c6, I could go bishop takes c4, d takes c4, knight takes c4, and if you go to queen b7 or queen b5, there's knight d6. So the only move in the position is actually queen d8. And after knight d6, rook f8, now I can go c4. And, yeah, I gave up a piece, but I have two pawns for it and very active pieces. And two connected pass pawns at that. So very promising position. Anyways, after d takes c4 is played, I went queen b1. And here is actually the huge problem and why this queen b6 and d takes c4 stuff was so flawed. The reason is black is actually really tied down. Note that you can't move the rook from e8, for instance, like to c8, because knight takes e4 is hanging. So the rook on e8 is tied to the e pawn. The knight on d7 is tied to the queen on b6 because there's knight takes c4 or bishop takes c4. And so those are huge problems. And last but not least, bishop c6 a move that you maybe would want to play, get the bishop off of a8, protect the b5 pawn again, actually loses on the spot to knight takes c4 anyway. And the point is that after b takes c4, queen takes b6, knight takes b6, rook a6 recovers the piece that was sacrificed with interest. Note that, again, this rook cannot come to b8 and protect the knight because of this bishop sitting on h2, just sniping it down. So this position would just be winning for white because the c4 pawn would collapse soon thereafter. So yeah, it actually is surprisingly difficult after queen b1 just to make moves. And yeah, I'm starting to plan the position. And my idea here was actually to go rook a2 and to pressure the b5 pawn even more. Black went for bishop d5, which does cover the c4 pawn. And now I went for the plan I just alluded to with rook a2. And the computers actually take a little bit of time to appreciate just how strong this is. But black is actually in serious, serious trouble because it's so difficult to get another piece to defend the b5 pawn. Again, I'm going to say this a million times, but the rook on e8 cannot go to b8. So after rook b2, it just seems like I'm just winning a pawn. And it's because of that that black actually went for the move bishop f8, trying to say, you know what? Okay, maybe you're trying to threaten the b5 pawn, but I actually can push it to b4. And so I went rook b2 because that was what my plan was. And now b4 was played, and it seems like all of a sudden black is getting really, really decent play because, if I take on b4, all of a sudden c3 comes, right? So if c takes b4, c3, and I'm losing a piece, that'd be super unfortunate. And if I don't do anything, maybe b3 comes and it becomes a dangerous protected pass pawn. Who knows? So this position was actually really, really critical here, and I thought for a little while, but I kind of realized that there was no going back from here. I either had to go forward or get rolled over because of this the threats that black had. So I decided to go forward and take the c4 pawn with my knight, with knight takes c4. And now black very quickly played queen c6. And here I actually thought for maybe 15 to 20 minutes trying to understand what was going on in the position. Note that my knight is attacked, and if I move my knight, let's say to, let's say to a5, all of a sudden queen a4 comes, and, oh no, not even queen a4. Queen takes c3 is actually playable, and the problem is this b4 pawn is well protected, and my knight on a5 is pretty much stranded, which is a problem. So I didn't really like the look of knight a5. Again, knight d2 is not really a possibility because b takes c3 and then this fork action comes again. And okay, I can pin the queen with rook c2, but the c3 pawn stays on the board and actually becomes a serious asset. For instance, if black just plays rook c8, overprotects the c3 pawn, it will be hard to hold this because this pawn is just going to be so dominant. So knight a5 wasn't so attractive. Knight d2 wasn't attractive. Really, there was no knight move that was attractive. And so my candidate moves were rook takes b4 or c takes b4. Now, if I play rook takes b4, I sacrifice an exchange. And if I play c takes b4, I sacrifice a piece. So why don't you think about this and pause the video and try to decide which line you would go for, rook takes b4 or c takes b4. All right, hopefully you got a moment to pause the video and try to figure out what you think is the best move. I actually thought for a really long... We're going to talk about both moves, but I actually thought for a while over rook takes b4. And the point is that after rook takes b4, I'm actually getting a second pawn, right? Because I'd already won one pawn. I'm getting a second pawn for the exchange. And my rook is protecting the knight on c4, so black has to take. And after bishop takes b4, queen takes b4, material is equal. And it would appear that, if I'm able to consolidate, I would actually have a promising position with the two connected passed pawns, because this bishop is doing a great job, and my bishop on e2 has the potential to be great if I'm able to push c4. And so this actually looks kind of dangerous for black. But unfortunately, black can play rook c8 and win the c3 pawn very quickly, and the line continues. I can go knight d6, queen takes c3, and here I just kind of stopped calculating, because it was clear to me that black already has recovered one of the pawns, so now he's technically a pawn up. And the issue is, if I trade queens, I'm just an exchange down, so I can't do that. But I didn't see any real way forward here, in particular because I have a weak back rank. The issue with my bishop on h2 right now is it's taking away the one escape square from my king, and so I'd have to waste a tempo on bishop g3 to get my king out, and I didn't even see how that'd be possible when this queen is coming down to c1 with check, and I'd have to block with f1, and I thought I'd just be super passive if I was pinned like that. Apparently the lines are equal. I could go queen b5, queen e1 check, bishop f1, and here's a funny line. Rook c1, right? Very, very dangerous, kind of totally causing havoc on f1. And bishop f4, trying to give myself an escape square to h2. And now bishop e6, a very important move, because now actually I was actually threatening to play queen takes d5, because queen takes f1, I can go king h2 and actually escape. And white would actually be winning because of the threats on the king side with queen f7. For instance, let's say h5 is played. It's a very bad move, but let's just say queen takes d5, queen f1, king h2, and all of a sudden white is just winning, because the f7 pawn is, cannot be protected, and black has a few checks, but nothing more than that. So I would just, win this one. But the funny thing is that after bishop e6, I still have this problem here, and I can't just give up a piece now because the bishop is covered, and I have no checks. And there's a really funny computer repetition here where I could go knight takes e4, rook b1, queen a6, rook a1, queen c6 check, king g1, and knight g3, funnily protecting my rook, my bishop on f1. And now I've protected f1, but f2 is sensitive, and rook a2 is a move. And look at this repetition. Knight h1, rook a1, knight g3, rook a2, knight h1. I thought that was hilarious. This knight on h1 protecting the pawn on f2. And, just a very, very peculiar repetition was possible. But anyway, you get the point here. Black has a lot of activity. And honestly, I thought it would be a little bit dangerous for white to play this, being so passive with the bishop on f1, that I wasn't quite confident that I would have full compensation there, especially because black gets one of the two pawns that was my comp for the exchange. So then I started to look at the other line with c takes b4 in this position. And the more I looked at it, the more I started to like it, because what I realized is that after I take on b4, I could play b5 with tempo, hitting the queen. And that means I'll be able to put my pawn on b6. And with my pawn on b6 and my bishop on h2, all of a sudden this pawn is very, very close to queening. And I thought I would have pretty good compensation for it. I wasn't sure what the evaluation was, but I thought with the pawn close to queening, and also I have a very, very healthy pawn structure, and there'd be a weak pawn on e4 that could potentially be a target, I thought that I should have enough compensation to hold, and it just seemed like a more attractive proposition than the line I just showed where I sacked the exchange. So after about 20 minutes, I played c takes b4. And amazingly, it turns out that this move is a winning move. I cannot believe it. I mean, I could not believe how smoothly the game went from here. But the more I started to calculate, like the more moves we played, the more I realized this position is really, really good for white. And the issue is that, black pretty much has to go for this line because he's 2 pawns down now. So anyways, after bishop takes c4, I played b5, and that's the key move. Before taking on c4, I played b5 with tempo and dislodged the queen. Very, very important. After queen d5, now I take on c4, And after queen takes c4, you can see I got a very, very important tempo with that b5 intermediate move. And now I played b6. And amazingly, b7, b8 is the threat, and it's incredibly difficult to stop. Note that you can't put the rook on b8. Why? Well, I've said it before, because this bishop on h2 is bearing down on it. And if you put the knight on b8, it's a very, very passive spot for the knight. So I thought, with the knight kind of being out of play, I'd get really good chances, and my rook and queen do just enough here to kind of keep the game, to cause enough problems. Another thing I was thinking about is that if you try to trade queens, let's say you play like rook c8, note that I can't go b7 right away because of queen c1 mate, and note because my king does not have an escape square, this would actually be a very sad and unfortunate checkmate. But actually, I can just start with the move bishop g3 or bishop f4 perhaps. And the point is that now I'm actually threatening b7, and I gave my king an escape square. And if you go queen c1, well, b7 is still on the cards, and yeah, you pretty much can't do much about it. After rook c8, I go b7 and rook e8, and now rook c2, and I can play rook c8 to force that pawn home. Or I can even play b8 queen right away. That's also fine. So just huge problems all of a sudden in this position for black. And it's once I got to this position with b6, I realized, hold on, I might actually be better here. And it was just a remarkable realization to basically stumble upon a line that's, winning by mistake. So anyways, after b6, there's really no very clean defense. I mean, everything is lost, but I'll show a few examples. I just showed rook c8. Another example is queen d3, right? Trying to get the queens off the board. What if we do that? Well, I go b7 anyway, and after queen takes b1, rook takes b1, let's say you play f5, trying to just say, you know what, I'm going to go for a pawn down ending and give up my knight for the b7 pawn. It actually doesn't really matter. This position is losing a pawn down, and it's really because of the health of my pawn structure. And just as a sample line, just to show you what this looks like, I can actually start with g4. And this move is super important because it undermines this chain and makes the e4 pawn very weak or the f5 pawn weak. So if you take on g4, all of a sudden e4 is isolated. But if you don't take on g4 and you go, let's say king f7, now I can actually challenge the f5 pawn. First I could take on b8. First I can play b8, queen, takes, and this pawn tension is so frustrating for black that it's actually a winning position because I can gang up on this f5 pawn if needed. And my bishop on b8 is much better than the bishop on f8 because my pawns are in dark squares blocking out my opponent's bishop. So let's say h5, rook b5, very important move. Not taking on f5 right away, piling up the pressure on this square. Point being that even at the temporary cost of a pawn, after bishop f4, this position is completely winning because all of black's pawns are so weak. And let's say bishop e7, king g2, bishop h4, bishop g5. I just thought this line was pretty funny. After bishop takes, rook takes, king f6, I don't take this pawn and, make my rook passive. No. Instead, I go rook c5. And the position is totally lost. My king walks up and collects the g4 pawn. And if the rook moves away from the e file, let's say rook b8, I just go rook e5 and collect the e4 pawn. And two connected passed pawns is winning. But I'll pick up a third pawn. I'll pick up both pawns very quickly because g4 is also weak. And it just goes to show that pawn structure and rook endgames is a really big deal because the nature of this pawn structure is so weak it can just be undermined. And yeah, it just means that even if you trade queens, there are problems in the endgame. So anyways, I hope you found that kind of instructive. I certainly thought it was quite remarkable, and I realized this during the game, that even if the knight sacrificed itself for my b pawn, I still have excellent winning chances. So anyways, after b6, black tried queen e6, and now I went b7, and I'm just threatening b8 queen. note that, well, bishop d6 was played, but again, note that if you play a move like knight b8, I probably go rook c2, and I'm going to invade on c8 eventually. Anyways, bishop d6 was played, and this is actually a reasonable trying to exchange the bishop that was doing such a great job holding the b8 square. But even after this exchange, black still has serious problems because of the move rook c2. And now the idea is to go rook c8, and all of a sudden I'm, basically threatening the e4 pawn and threatening to collect a third pawn. And the real issue is that even if black is a piece up and the rooks are off the board, the issue is that as long as the knight is tied to the b8 pawn, the b8 square and the b7 pawn, it's pretty much, not really playing, and I can just play on the other side of the board if the knight is tied to the b pawn, and those two factors can just nullify each other. So, unfortunately, trading pieces doesn't actually solve the problem. After rook c2, black went knight b8, and now I went rook c8, and this is like a perfect illustration of that problem, because now I'm threatening queen takes e4, and the knight is just, totally tied down, and the queen is also tied down to protecting that knight. Queen d7 was played now, and now I went queen c2, and this is another illustration of just how black's pieces are all overworked, because queen takes b7 is not possible because rook takes c8. And yeah, black is just totally tied up, and there is not a great way to improve. Note that if you play, let's say you play a move like h5, I have many ways to press the advantage here, but one really attractive one is actually just to play rook takes c8, queen takes c8, and queen c8. And the issue here is that the king can't actually come closer, or much closer rather, to support the knight. And the knight on b8 is just going to be tied to the b8 square. And so if after king f8, I believe that black is kind of in a weird zugzwang where he can't really improve his position very much. And now I can actually start walking the d pawn up the board. After d5, king e7, d6, king f8, yeah, just totally lost because, again, there's no really good moves for white to play here. And again, for black to play. The king is tied up. The knight can only go back to d7 and b8. And now my king can walk in. And so I can play like, let's say, h4 and then just walk my king in. And black is just totally tied up. So anyways, just really nice when even the endgames a piece down are winning. But anyways, after queen c2, black went king f8. That is a reasonable trying to bring the king closer. And I went queen c5 check now, challenging that king on f8, trying to push it back to g8. And now black went queen e7. And yeah, I realized now that black was going to try to trade the queens and try to defend the connected pass pawns with the knight and the rook. And I realized that that position would probably be losing because the knight is going to have to sacrifice itself for at least one of my pawns. But the key thing is that my king on g1 needs to get involved in the game for it to be a clean win. And so I just need to calculate here how to get my king in the game, because if my king could get into f4 and challenge these weak pawns, as I alluded to earlier with the structure like this, I would probably have a winning position. So I actually calculated for a while, and I actually managed to find a forced win from here. So this whole line that's coming up, I actually calculated to the finish. And yeah, I'm actually not the best at calculation, but I thought this was a nice bit of work I did here. So sit back and enjoy. So first I start with rook c7. That forces the queens off the board and gives me a favorable connected pass pawns. So now queen takes c5 is forced, and after d takes c5, the threat is rook c8 and c6. Black now went rook d8. I don't know, maybe trying to get the rook behind the pawn with rook d1. And I went c6. And the funny thing here is that now there's just amazing threats. But let's say black goes h5. Now my threat's actually rook takes f7. And the point is that after king takes f7, c7 is winning. And boy, isn't this a pretty sight where because I can promote with c8, there's just nothing you can do here. I just think it's a very pretty line. Two connected passed pawns winning. Didn't who was that said pawns are the soul of chess? Yeah. But yeah, because of that c6 threat, black needed to go king e8. And now the point is that if I go, rook takes f7 is not so hot anymore because knight takes c6 is a move. So wouldn't want to go for that. So instead I went, this is actually the critical position of the game after king e8. And the thing you have to realize is that black really can't improve. Because if black really can't move the knight anywhere, because then I just go rook c8. And the rook can't really move from d1 because then I just go rook c8. And so there's really nothing black can do, and I just need to get my king involved. And I wanted to go king h2, but I thought it was smarter to start with the move g4. And this was a huge part of the line that I calculated. And the point is with g4, I introduced my king up the board like this via g2, and I also threaten g5 in some lines in which one pawn manages to control 3 because of en passant. So anyways, knight takes c6 was played here. It's pretty much the only move to try and fight here. And after rook takes c6, king d7, Karen's trying to get at the b7 pawn, trying to get to some type of drawn rook endgame, but it just doesn't work. I go rook f6 first to hit the f7 pawn. It's a very, very important tempo gainer. Because now after king e7, now I can go rook b6 back. And the point is that after rook b8, the king is not on d7. Note that if I played rook b6 right away, now after king c7, this wouldn't be so clear because now if my rook moves, let's say, back, now after rook b8, this position is not as easy anymore because he can corral the b7 pawn. So instead, I go rook f6 first, drag the king to e7, then rook b6. And after rook b8, here was my key idea, was the move g5. And this move seals the win because now the rook on b8 is paralyzed, and black can't push the f-pawn or the h-pawn without it being lost to en passant. And that means that pawn endgames are winning for me because my king can walk up the board and attack this e4 pawn. So now black went king d7, but after king g2, king c7, rook b4, and now rook takes b7, I actually can just trade to a pawn endgame because e4 is hanging. And so after rook takes b7, king takes, king g3, you could see why I played g4 and g5. With one pawn on g5 controls all three of black's pawns, and unfortunately black cannot protect the d5 pawn, or the e4 pawn. After king c6, king f4, and king d5, he is controlling it for a moment, but I saw that I have the tempo winning h4, or the zugzwang creating h4, and now black has no good moves. If you push the f-pawn, you lose it. If you push the h-pawn, you lose it. And if you move the king, you lose e4. And so black has to cede ground with f5. Well, he could have tried to move the king away, but this also is easily winning. But he decided to play f5. And I played g takes f6, king e6, king takes e4, king takes f6, and king f4. And yeah, the rest is really just a matter of technique, being having a 3 versus 2 right now. Black went h6. I went king g4, g5, h takes g, and now e4. And the point is that if the king goes to g6, I'll just go e5. So the king went to e5, and now I just went f3. I could have gone king takes g5, and after king takes f4, but I just wanted to show that I didn't have to give up the e4 pawn, so I went f3. And then the point is that after king f6, now I just go king h5. And again, I'm kind of outflanking the black king, and g5 is just going to be lost. And so after king h5, Karen actually resigned. This was easily the best game I played so far in the tournament. I was really, really happy with the win. And it was just a really, really nice, turn of events from an opening that was fairly harmless. I managed to get an interesting position and then outplayed him in the middle game. And I think this is the type of formula that, not opening-wise necessarily, but just chess-wise, this is the formula that really works for me on my best day, is when I'm able to get a position and then grind out and show that I have some ideas, and then convert in the end game and show that end game technique that I hope that I'm known for. So anyways, with this win, I actually was on 50% now, and it was just what a turn of events in these last 2 rounds. I was super optimistic and really, really excited at the development. So thrilled, absolutely thrilled going into the last round. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.